The massive alien warship Nexus Prime drifted through the void of space, like a metal mountain studded with weapons and glowing ports. Inside its steel corridors, the sound of heavy footsteps echoed as soldiers from different worlds prepared for what they believed would be another easy conquest. The ship carried warriors from 3 major species of the Galactic Coalition, each one proud of their military might and proven track record of bringing primitive worlds under their control. Commander Zexler stood in the main briefing room, his towering frame casting long shadows across the metal floor. His 4 powerful arms moved with practiced ease as he adjusted the holographic display that showed their target. Half of his scarred face was covered with cybernetic implants that glowed with a cold blue light, marking him as a veteran of countless battles. His yellow eyes scanned the assembled troops with the confidence of someone who had never known defeat. The Krathari soldiers under his command were giants among their kind, each one standing nearly 9 feet tall with thick armor plating that covered their muscular bodies. Their forearms ended in clawed hands that could tear through steel, and their faces bore the ritual scars that marked them as elite warriors. They had conquered 17 different worlds in the past decade, and their reputation for brutality was known throughout the galaxy. Beside them stood the Vex Scouts, insectoid creatures with compound eyes that could track multiple targets simultaneously. Their thin bodies moved with deadly grace, and the razor-sharp mandibles that extended from their mouths could slice through bone with ease. Captain Clicker led this group, his chittering voice carrying the arrogance of someone who had never encountered an enemy his kind could not outmaneuver and destroy. The third group consisted of Zephyrian telepaths, ethereal beings who floated several inches above the ground rather than walking. Their pale skin seemed to glow with inner light, and their large black eyes could peer directly into the minds of their enemies. Major Villanara commanded these psychic warriors, her mental abilities allowing her to coordinate attacks and break enemy morale before the first shot was fired. At the center of the room, bound in energy shackles that prevented any movement, sat Lieutenant Commander Jake Morrison. He was the only human aboard the ship, captured 3 weeks earlier when the aliens had destroyed Earth's orbital defense station during their initial scouting mission. His uniform was torn and dirty, but his eyes remained defiant despite weeks of interrogation and captivity. Commander Zexler activated the holographic display with a gesture from one of his massive hands. The image showed a blue and green world orbiting a yellow star, with small settlements scattered across its surface, like tiny dots of light. This was their target, a human colony world called New Terran that intelligence reports suggested would fall within hours of their arrival. Captain Clickter's mandibles clicked together in what passed for laughter among his species as he studied the tactical information. The human defenses consisted of basic projectile weapons, primitive vehicles, and a small militia force that numbered less than 5,000 individuals. Compared to the advanced plasma weapons, energy shields, and superior numbers of the coalition forces, it seemed like a joke. Major Villanara floated closer to the display, her mental voice echoing in the minds of everyone present as she shared her contempt for human military capabilities. She had probed the mind of their prisoner extensively and found what she considered to be laughably simple thought patterns and emotional responses. Humans, she declared, were driven by illogical concepts like honor and loyalty that made them predictable and easy to manipulate. The alien soldiers began sharing stories of other primitive species they had conquered, each tale more amusing than the last. They spoke of civilizations that had surrendered after losing a single battle, of warriors who fled at the first sign of superior technology, and of entire planets that had begged for mercy rather than face the full might of the coalition military. Machine Commander Zexler pulled up video files that had been recovered from human military databases, showing footage of what humans called their greatest warriors and most legendary battles. The aliens watched with growing amusement as primitive soldiers fought with crude weapons and outdated tactics. They saw humans charging into certain death, holding positions against impossible odds and refusing to surrender even when facing complete annihilation. Captain Clicker found particular entertainment in human concepts of heroism and sacrifice. He could not understand why any logical species would choose death over the practical option of surrender and service to their conquerors. The idea that humans would die for abstract concepts like freedom and independence struck him as evidence of severe mental deficiency rather than courage. The Krathari warriors roared with laughter as they watched footage of human soldiers using primitive explosives and basic firearms against enemies with superior numbers and equipment. They had seen this pattern countless times before on dozens of different worlds, and it always ended the same way. The primitive species would make a brief show of resistance before accepting the inevitable reality of their technological inferiority. Major Velanara shared her analysis of human psychological profiles, describing them as emotionally unstable creatures who allowed feelings to override logical decision-making. She explained that humans formed strong emotional bonds with their companions that could be exploited as weaknesses, and that their tendency to value individual lives over strategic objectives made them vulnerable to psychological warfare. Jake Morrison listened to their mockery in silence, his jaw clenched as he watched classified footage of human special forces operations being treated as entertainment by creatures who had never faced a determined human enemy. He knew things about his species that these aliens had never encountered, things that their intelligence reports and psychological profiles could never reveal. The briefing continued for another hour as Commander Zexter outlined their battle plan. The attack would begin with orbital bombardment of key military installations, followed by landing craft deploying troops at strategic points around the human settlements. They expected organized resistance to collapse within the first day, with cleanup operations requiring no more than a week to complete. As the alien soldiers filed out of the briefing room to prepare their equipment and weapons, their conversation centered on how quickly they could subdue this latest group of primitives. They made bets on how long the humans would hold out before surrendering, with most estimates ranging from hours to days at most. None of them seriously considered the possibility that creatures armed with such basic technology could pose any real threat to their advanced military forces. Jake Morrison remained in his energy bonds as the room emptied, staring at the tactical display that still showed his fellow humans going about their daily lives on New Terran. They had no idea that death was coming for them from the stars, carried by creatures who viewed human courage and determination as nothing more than amusing entertainment before the slaughter began. 3 days after the briefing, the Nexus Prime entered orbit around New Terran just as the local sun began to rise over the main colonial settlement. The planet looked peaceful from space, with white clouds drifting over green farmland and small cities that showed no signs of military preparation. Commander Zexter stood on the bridge watching the surface through the main viewport, confident that this would be another routine conquest to add to his record. The first phase of the attack began exactly as planned. Plasma cannons fired from orbit, striking the small spaceport and the communications array that linked the colony to other human worlds. The explosions created massive craters where buildings had stood moments before, and the bright flashes could be seen from hundreds of miles away. Within minutes, the human colony was cut off from any hope of outside assistance. Captain Lisa Carter crouched in the underground command bunker beneath the Colonial Administration building, watching her tactical displays flicker as alien jamming systems interfered with their basic electronics. She had been expecting this attack ever since deep space sensors had detected the approaching alien fleet, but hoping for it and being ready for it were two very different things. Her militia forces consisted mostly of farmers and mechanics who had received basic military training, armed with conventional firearms and a few pieces of outdated military equipment. The alien landing craft descended through the atmosphere like metallic teardrops, their energy shields glowing as they deflected the few surface-to-air missiles that the humans managed to launch. The ships touched down in perfect formation at strategic points around the settlement, their doors opening to release troops that moved with the precision of a well-oiled military machine. Commander Zexter led the main assault force personally, his forearms carrying weapons that could melt through concrete walls. Behind him marched rows of Krathari warriors, their heavy footsteps shaking the ground as they advanced toward the human defensive positions. Their plasma rifles charged with deadly energy, and their confidence showed in every movement as they approached what they expected to be a brief and one-sided battle. The human defenders opened fire from concealed positions among the colonial buildings, their projectile weapons creating bright muzzle flashes in the early morning light. The bullets struck the alien energy shields and bounced off harmlessly, exactly as the coalition forces had expected. Captain Clichter and his Vex scouts moved around the flanks with lightning speed, their compound eyes tracking multiple human positions simultaneously as they prepared to eliminate the primitive defenders for the first few hours. Everything proceeded according to the alien battle plan. Human defensive positions fell one by one as superior firepower and technology overwhelmed the colonial militia. The defenders retreated steadily toward the center of the settlement, leaving behind damaged buildings and scattered equipment. Major Velanara used her telepathic abilities to track human thoughts, easily predicting their movements and coordinating alien attacks to maximum effect. Captain Carter coordinated the retreat from her bunker, using primitive radio communications that she knew the aliens could intercept. She ordered her forces to fall back to secondary positions, buying time for civilian evacuations while knowing that her small force could not hope to stop the alien advance. The enemy had every advantage in terms of numbers, weapons, and technology. As the local sun reached its peak and began to descend toward the horizon, something unexpected began to happen. Human defenders who had been presumed dead started appearing behind alien lines, emerging from buildings that had been cleared hours earlier. Small groups of colonists armed with hunting rifles and improvised explosives began striking at alien supply lines and communication posts. The first sign that something was wrong came when a Krathari patrol failed to report in. When Commander Zexler sent a search team to investigate, they found the missing soldiers dead in an alley, killed by explosive devices that had been hidden under debris. The humans had used their knowledge of the local terrain to set traps that even the advanced alien sensors had failed to detect. Captain Clichter reported increasing problems with human fighters who seemed to appear and disappear like ghosts. His scouts would clear a building thoroughly, only to have humans emerge from hidden basements or underground tunnels after the aliens had moved on. These improvised guerrilla fighters used hit-and-run tactics that frustrated the coalition forces, who had been trained for conventional warfare against enemies who fought in predictable patterns. Major Velanara found her telepathic abilities less effective than expected when probing human minds under combat stress. The defenders had an unusual ability to compartmentalize their fear and continue functioning normally even when terrified. More disturbing was their apparent willingness to accept certain death rather than surrender, a mental attitude that she had never encountered in other species. As darkness fell over New Terran, the nature of the conflict began to change in ways that confused and concerned the alien commanders. Human resistance fighters moved through the settlement using underground passages and hidden routes that had been prepared for exactly this type of invasion. They struck at alien positions with coordinated attacks that suggested better organization and planning than intelligence reports had indicated. The most disturbing development was the behavior of wounded human defenders. Rather than surrendering when injured, they continued fighting until death or unconsciousness claimed them. Entire squads of militia members chose to die in place rather than retreat when their positions became untenable, inflicting casualties on alien forces that were completely disproportionate to their primitive weapons and training. Commander Zexler found himself dealing with a type of warfare that his extensive military experience had never prepared him for. The humans were not fighting to win in any conventional sense, but rather to exact the highest possible price for their defeat. Every building had to be cleared multiple times, every street corner might hide an ambush, and every fallen human might be carrying explosives designed to kill anyone who approached their body. Don Rodriguez, a maintenance worker turned militia sergeant, had been holding a critical intersection for 6 hours using nothing but a hunting rifle and homemade explosive devices. His position controlled access to the main civilian evacuation route, and alien forces could not advance without eliminating him. Wave after wave of Crethary warriors had tried to dislodge him from his improvised fortress in a damaged warehouse, but his intimate knowledge of the building's layout allowed him to stay one step ahead of their attacks. Captain Carter listened to radio reports from across the battlefield, hearing stories that should have been impossible. Farmers were building explosive devices from agricultural chemicals and holding off alien patrols for hours at a time. Mechanics were modifying civilian vehicles into mobile weapons platforms that struck at alien convoys before disappearing into the maze of colonial buildings. Even children were serving as messengers and spotters, moving through areas too dangerous for adults to traverse. By dawn, the coalition forces controlled most of the settlement's major buildings and strategic positions, but the cost had been far higher than anyone had anticipated. What should have been a simple conquest had turned into a grinding urban warfare nightmare that consumed resources and personnel at an alarming rate. Human resistance showed no signs of weakening despite devastating losses, and their tactics seemed to grow more sophisticated with each passing hour. Commander Zexter stood in the captured administration building, studying tactical reports that made no sense according to everything he knew about primitive species. His forces had achieved their primary objectives, but human defenders continued to emerge from hidden positions throughout the settlement. The conquest that should have taken hours was stretching into its second day, with no clear end in sight. The alien soldiers who had laughed at human legends just days earlier now moved through the settlement with nervous caution, never knowing when the next attack might come or from what direction. They had discovered that conquering humans was very different from conquering other primitive species, and the difference was becoming more terrifying with each passing hour. Over the following weeks, similar reports began flooding into coalition command centers from 12 other human worlds that were under simultaneous attack. Each planet told the same disturbing story that commanders across the galaxy were struggling to understand. Initial alien victories followed by increasingly brutal and effective human resistance that defied every principle of logical military doctrine. The pattern was so consistent that it could not be explained by coincidence or luck. On the mining world of Kepler Station, Sergeant Don Rodriguez had become a legend among both human defenders and alien attackers. The former maintenance worker had transformed a damaged or processing facility into an impregnable fortress, using his intimate knowledge of the industrial equipment to create death traps that claimed alien lives with horrifying efficiency. His position controlled the only access route to the underground mine shafts where 3,000 civilian miners had taken refuge. Commander Zexter received hourly reports about Rodriguez's impossible stand against an entire Crethary battalion. The human sergeant had been fighting continuously for 18 hours, using nothing but conventional explosives, a basic rifle, and an understanding of industrial machinery that allowed him to turn mining equipment into weapons. Every attempt to dislodge him resulted in more alien casualties, and his defensive position only seemed to grow stronger as time passed. The Crethary warriors had never encountered anything like Rodriguez's tactics. He would appear at windows to take carefully aimed shots before disappearing into the maze of conveyor belts and processing machinery that filled the facility. When they tried to assault his position directly, hidden explosive charges would detonate, bringing down sections of the building on top of their advancing forces. The few aliens who managed to penetrate the facility found themselves lost in a labyrinth of industrial equipment, where every shadow might hide a deadly trap. Captain Clichter led repeated attempts to flank Rodriguez's position, but the human had anticipated every possible approach and prepared accordingly. His Vex scouts reported that the facility was honeycombed with hidden passages and improvised weapons that made advancement nearly impossible. The sergeant seemed to have unlimited ammunition and explosives, though intelligence reports indicated that the mining station's armory had been destroyed in the initial bombardment. Major Velanara attempted to use her telepathic abilities to locate Rodriguez and predict his movements, but found his mind shielded by a determination so absolute that it interfered with her psychic probes. The human's thoughts were focused entirely on his mission to protect the miners. with no consideration given to his own survival or the mathematical impossibility of his situation. This level of mental discipline was something she had never encountered in any other species. When Rodriguez's position finally fell after 18 hours of continuous combat, the aliens discovered that he had been fighting alone for the last 6 hours after his few remaining defenders had been killed or wounded. He had continued the battle by himself, moving through the facility to create the illusion that multiple fighters were still active. His body was found surrounded by dozens of empty ammunition containers and the components of explosive devices that he had been building from mining equipment. The report from Kepler Station was disturbing enough, but it was followed by even more troubling news from the oceanic world of Aquatica. The human naval forces on that planet had continued attacking alien landing craft even after their main fleet had been completely destroyed in the initial orbital bombardment. Commander Steve Walsh had led the survivors of the naval battle in increasingly desperate attacks that made no strategic sense to alien military analysts. Walsh's final action had shocked even veteran coalition commanders who thought they had seen every possible variation of desperate last stands. With only one functional submarine remaining from his entire fleet, he had loaded the vessel with nuclear warheads salvaged from destroyed ships and rammed it directly into the alien command vessel that was coordinating the planetary invasion. The underwater explosion had not only destroyed both ships, but had created a massive shockwave that crippled half the alien invasion fleet. The most disturbing aspect of Walsh's sacrifice was the planning and coordination it had required. Investigation of the wreckage revealed that the submarine had been modified over several days to serve as a massive explosive device, with systems installed to ensure that the nuclear warheads would detonate even if the crew was killed before reaching their target. The level of technical expertise and determination required for such a mission spoke to capabilities that alien intelligence had never attributed to human naval forces, but it was the report from Gibraltar Base that truly began to change how alien commanders viewed their human enemies. Colonel Amy Thompson and her garrison of 300 soldiers had been completely surrounded and cut off from any hope of reinforcement or resupply. The fortress was built on a rocky plateau with only one narrow access route, making it nearly impossible to assault but equally impossible to escape from once surrounded. The siege of Gibraltar Base lasted 6 weeks, during which time alien forces made repeated attempts to overwhelm the human defenders through direct assault, bombardment, and psychological warfare. Every attack was repelled with losses that seemed impossible given the disparity in numbers and equipment. The humans had turned their isolated position into a killing ground that consumed alien forces at a rate that their commanders found unacceptable. Major Velinara had personally led the psychological warfare campaign against Gibraltar Base, using her telepathic abilities to project images of defeat and surrender into the minds of the human defenders. She had expected the isolated garrison to break under the mental pressure of their hopeless situation, but instead found that their resolve only seemed to strengthen as their position became more desperate. The final assault on Gibraltar Base required the commitment of an entire alien division, far more forces than should have been necessary to overcome 300 primitive defenders. When the fortress finally fell, the investigation of the position revealed the true extent of human determination and resourcefulness. The defenders had been fighting with dwindling supplies for the last 3 weeks, eating emergency rations that were meant to last only a few days and sharing ammunition between squads to keep their weapons functional. The base's medical facility told an even more disturbing story. Wounded humans who should have been evacuated or declared unfit for duty had continued fighting from stretchers and improvised positions. Soldiers with broken bones had served as ammunition carriers, while those with severe injuries had volunteered for suicide missions against alien positions. The level of dedication to their mission went far beyond what any rational military doctrine would consider reasonable or necessary. Colonel Thompson's final transmission had been recorded by alien communication interceptors and distributed throughout coalition command structure as an example of human irrationality. Her voice had remained steady and calm even as alien forces breached the final defensive perimeter. We die here, but we die free." The transmission had cut off abruptly, but subsequent investigation revealed that Thompson had detonated the base's ammunition depot rather than allow it to fall into alien hands. These reports created a growing unease among alien rank and file. Soldiers who had enlisted for what they believed would be routine conquest operations. Veterans who had participated in dozens of successful invasions began questioning whether humans represented something fundamentally different from other primitive species they had encountered. The casualty rates were unlike anything in Coalition military history, and the pattern of human resistance showed no signs of weakening even when facing certain defeat. Commander Zexter found himself reviewing battle reports that contradicted everything he had learned during his long military career. Human defenders consistently chose death over surrender, continued fighting long after their positions became untenable, and somehow managed to inflict disproportionate casualties on technologically superior alien forces. The mathematical models that predicted easy victory had proven completely inaccurate when applied to human resistance. Captain Clichter submitted a formal report questioning whether human military capabilities had been severely underestimated. In pre-invasion intelligence assessments, his Vex scouts were reporting behavior patterns that suggested humans possessed tactical knowledge and combat experience that went far beyond what their primitive technology would indicate. The consistency of their resistance across multiple worlds implied coordination and planning that should have been impossible for such a supposedly backward species. The growing realization among coalition forces was that they had not invaded a collection of primitive agricultural worlds populated by simple farmers and miners. Instead, they had somehow stumbled into a conflict with a species that seemed to grow more dangerous when cornered, that treated certain death as an acceptable cost for inflicting casualties on their enemies, and that possessed an institutional knowledge of warfare that ran far deeper than their basic technology would suggest. Jake Morrison listened to these reports from his confinement aboard the Nexus Prime. Commander Zexter stood in his private quarters staring at casualty reports that should have been impossible. His cybernetic eye flickered as it processed data streams from 12 different battlefields, each one telling the same impossible story. Coalition forces were suffering losses at rates that defied every military calculation and strategic projection. The humans were supposed to be primitive farmers and miners, yet they were fighting like the most elite warriors in the galaxy. The breaking point had come that morning when he received the final report from Kepler Station. Sergeant Rodriguez was dead, but it had taken an entire Crathery Battalion 18 hours to kill one human defender. The cost in alien lives and equipment was so disproportionate that Zexter's superiors were demanding explanations that he could not provide. Similar reports from other worlds painted the same disturbing picture of a species that became more dangerous when cornered rather than less. Zexter activated the emergency command conference system, summoning his senior staff to an immediate meeting. Captain Clichter arrived first, his compound eyes reflecting the stress of commanding scout forces that were taking unprecedented casualties. His mandibles clicked nervously as he reviewed tactical displays that showed human resistance growing stronger rather than weaker despite massive losses. Major Velinara floated into the conference room with her usual ethereal grace, but her pale skin showed signs of mental exhaustion that came from prolonged telepathic combat. She had been probing human minds for weeks, trying to understand the psychological mechanisms that allowed them to function normally while facing certain death. What she had discovered challenged everything she thought she knew about rational behavior and survival instincts. The final member of the command staff was Jake Morrison, still bound in energy shackles but now present at all strategy meetings. His insight into human psychology had become unexpectedly valuable as alien commanders struggled to predict and counter human tactical decisions. Morrison said little during these sessions, but his presence served as a constant reminder that the humans they were fighting were not just statistics on tactical displays. Commander Zexter began the meeting by displaying the latest casualty figures on the main holographic projector. The numbers were stark and undeniable. Coalition forces had suffered more losses in 3 weeks of fighting humans than they had in the previous 5 years of conquering other primitive species. The technological advantages that should have guaranteed quick victory were being negated by human tactics that seemed to ignore conventional military logic. Captain Clichter was the first to voice what everyone was thinking. His chittering voice carried a note of confusion that was unusual for the normally confident Vex officer. He reported that his scouts were encountering human fighters who seemed to possess combat knowledge that went far beyond basic militia training. Their tactics were sophisticated, their traps were cleverly designed, and their ability to coordinate resistance activities suggested military experience that intelligence reports had never indicated. The Vex captain had intercepted human communications that referenced historical battles and military leaders with names like Thermopylae, Stalingrad, and figures called Leonidas and Patton. These references seemed to inspire continued resistance even in hopeless situations, as if the humans were drawing strength from some collective memory of past conflicts. The pattern suggested that human military knowledge was far more extensive than their primitive technology would indicate. Major Velinara reported her most disturbing findings from telepathic probes of human minds. She had discovered that humans possessed an unusual ability to compartmentalize fear and continue functioning normally even while terrified. More troubling was their collective mental resilience that seemed to draw strength from desperation rather than weaken from it. This psychological profile was unlike anything she had encountered in other species. The Zephyrian Major described human minds as containing layers of defensive mechanisms that had been built up over countless generations of conflict and hardship. Their thoughts were structured in ways that allowed them to accept certain death as preferable to surrender, and their emotional bonds with fellow humans created a network of mutual support that made them nearly immune to psychological warfare. These mental characteristics suggested evolutionary adaptation to prolonged conflict rather than peaceful agricultural development. Commander Zexler listened to these reports with growing unease. The pieces of a larger puzzle were beginning to fall into place, and the picture they formed was far more disturbing than simple tactical miscalculations. He had been avoiding a truth that was becoming impossible to ignore, a secret from his own military service that cast human resistance in an entirely different light. 50 years earlier, during his service as a junior officer, Zexler had been present when coalition forces had captured a single human exploration ship near the edge of their territorial space. The vessel had been damaged and alone, its crew consisting of only one survivor who identified himself as Captain Rick Blake. Standard procedure had been to interrogate the prisoner for intelligence about his species, before disposing of him as a potential security threat. Blake had been held in coalition detention facilities for several months, while xenobiologists and military analysts studied human physiology and psychology. The prisoner had been cooperative during interrogation, answering questions about human technology and culture with what seemed like honest directness. His responses had painted a picture of a primitive species that posed no significant threat to coalition expansion plans, but Blake had also issued warnings that coalition interrogators had dismissed as the desperate boasting of a defeated enemy. He had tried to explain that humans were fundamentally different from other species that the coalition had encountered, that their history and psychology were shaped by forces that alien minds could not easily understand. His warnings had been recorded and filed away as psychological warfare attempts rather than genuine intelligence. The human captain had described his species as the descendants of persistence hunters who had survived ice ages, plagues, and countless wars by simply refusing to give up. He had explained that human civilization was built on the principle that some things were worth dying for, and that this belief was embedded so deeply in their culture that it influenced every aspect of their behavior. Blake had warned that humans would never submit to alien rule, because submission was literally incompatible with their evolved psychology. More disturbing had been Blake's descriptions of human military history. He had spoken of battles where outnumbered human forces had held impossible positions against overwhelming odds. of sieges that lasted for years, and of resistance movements that continued fighting long after conventional military wisdom said they should have surrendered. These were not isolated incidents, Blake had insisted, but examples of a consistent pattern that defined human responses to existential threats. The Coalition. Interrogators had tested Blake's claims by showing him footage of other conquered species, expecting him to express fear or despair at the evidence of Coalition military superiority. Instead, the human had studied the tactical displays with professional interest, pointing out weaknesses in alien battle tactics and suggesting how human forces would have responded differently to the same situations. His analysis had been uncomfortably accurate. Blake's final warning had been the most chilling. He had explained that the humans the Coalition might encounter in the future would not be diplomats or explorers like himself, but defenders fighting for their homes and families. He had described what he called the fighting retreat mentality that characterized human warfare, where tactical withdrawals were used to draw enemies into prepared killing grounds. Every step backward would cost the invaders more than the step forward had gained them. Commander Zexter had been present when Blake was finally executed, and he remembered the human's last words with uncomfortable clarity. The prisoner had shown no fear of death, instead expressing regret that he would not be able to warn his people about the coming invasion. His final statement had been a simple declaration: "You have no idea what you're about to wake up." The Coalition command had dismissed Blake's warnings as primitive bravado and filed his interrogation records in classified archives, where they had been forgotten for 50 years. The human's execution had been recorded as the elimination of a potential security threat, and no further action had been deemed necessary. The single human ship had been studied and scrapped, its advanced technology noted but not considered significant enough to warrant concern. Now, as Zexter reviewed casualty reports from 12 human worlds, Blake's warnings took on a prophetic quality that made his cybernetic implants flicker with stress indicators. The patterns of resistance that the Coalition was encountering matched the humans' descriptions with terrifying accuracy. The humans were not fighting like primitive farmers defending their homes, but like the descendants of warriors who had been perfecting the art of warfare for thousands of years. Jake Morrison had been listening to this discussion in silence, but now he finally spoke. His voice was steady despite weeks of captivity. Commander Zexter ordered an immediate and complete review of all available human historical data, no longer viewing it as primitive entertainment but as crucial intelligence about a species that represented an existential threat to everything the Coalition understood about warfare. The analysis teams worked around the clock, processing thousands of years of human records with the growing realization that they had completely misunderstood what they were facing. The data revealed a pattern that chilled even battle-hardened alien veterans to their core. Humans had been fighting continuous wars for their entire recorded history, not out of primitive bloodlust or territorial greed, but as a species that had evolved to thrive under pressure. Every major advancement in human civilization, from agriculture to space travel, had been driven by the need to survive and overcome seemingly impossible challenges. Their legends were not just stories designed to inspire courage, but cultural programming that taught each generation that surrender was never an option. Dr. Elena Martinez was brought before the alien command staff under heavy guard, her hands bound but her expression calm despite weeks of captivity. The human xenobiologist had been captured during the initial assault on New Terran, and her scientific background made her uniquely qualified to explain her species' psychological and evolutionary development. She had been kept isolated until now, but the desperate need for understanding had made her expertise too valuable to ignore. Martinez looked around the conference room with professional interest, studying the alien commanders who had been struggling to understand human resistance for weeks. Her voice was steady and clinical as she began to explain the evolutionary history that had shaped her species into what the aliens were now encountering. She described humans as persistence predators who had historically hunted prey by following it until it collapsed from exhaustion. a hunting strategy that required patience, endurance, and absolute refusal to give up. This same mentality, Martinez explained, had been applied to every aspect of human development, including warfare. Humans did not fight to win quickly through superior technology or overwhelming force. Instead, they fought until their enemies broke from the psychological and physical cost of continued conflict. This approach had allowed them to survive against predators, diseases, climate changes, and other human groups that should have destroyed them according to normal evolutionary principles. The xenobiologists described human brain structure as uniquely adapted for long-term stress and conflict. Unlike other species that experience psychological breakdown when faced with prolonged danger, humans actually became more focused and effective under extreme pressure. Their nervous systems were designed to function normally in situations that would paralyze other creatures with fear. Martinez explained that human culture had developed elaborate systems for passing tactical knowledge from one generation to the next through stories, ceremonies, and training that began in childhood. Every human child learned about historical figures who had faced impossible odds and chosen to fight anyway. These were not mythical heroes, but real people whose examples had been preserved and studied for thousands of years. The most disturbing revelation came when Martinez described human military academies where officers spent years studying historical battles, not just for their strategic value, but for the psychological lessons they contained. Human commanders were trained to think in terms of campaigns that might last decades, with the understanding that immediate tactical losses were acceptable if they contributed to long-term strategic victory. Captain Clichter interrupted with a question that had been troubling him for weeks. He wanted to know how humans could continue fighting effectively while suffering casualty rates that should have broken their morale completely. Martinez smiled grimly as she explained that humans measured victory differently than other species. They did not count success by territory gained or enemies killed, but by the cost they imposed on their attackers. Major Velinar asked about the psychological mechanisms that allowed humans to function normally while facing certain death. The Zephyrian telepath had been disturbed by her inability to break human morale through mental manipulation, and she needed to understand how their minds could resist psychic pressure so effectively. Martinez described the concept of compartmentalization, where humans could separate their fear of death from their tactical decision-making process. This mental discipline was not unique to professional soldiers, Martinez continued, but was taught to all humans as part of their basic cultural education. Even civilians were trained to function under extreme stress, to make rational decisions while terrified, and to prioritize group survival over individual safety. These psychological tools were embedded so deeply in human development that they operated at an unconscious level. Commander Zexter asked the question that had been haunting him since reviewing the casualty reports. He wanted to know if the humans they had been fighting represented the best that the species could offer in terms of military capability. Martinez looked at him with an expression that might have been pity as she explained that the colonial defenders were mostly farmers, mechanics, and families who had taken up arms only when invaded. The real shock came when she described Earth's actual military forces. Human armies consisted of professional soldiers who had spent their entire adult lives studying warfare and training for exactly this type of conflict. These forces had access to weapons and tactics that the colonists could never have imagined, along with institutional knowledge that went back thousands of years. The aliens had been fighting civilians, and the civilians had been winning. Martinez described human special forces units, whose training regimens were designed to prepare them for fighting technologically superior enemies. These soldiers practiced operating with minimal equipment, using improvised weapons, and surviving in hostile environments where everything was trying to kill them. They were experts at turning enemy advantages into disadvantages through superior tactics and intimate knowledge of terrain. Jake Morrison finally broke his silence to confirm Martinez's explanations with details that made the alien commanders shift uncomfortably in their seats. He described human military doctrine that was specifically designed for fighting enemies with superior technology and numbers. Every human officer was trained to think like an insurgent, to turn every building into a fortress and every piece of equipment into a potential weapon. Morrison explained that human military history was full of examples where small forces had held off larger enemies for months or years through superior tactics and absolute refusal to surrender. These were not isolated incidents but consistent patterns that had been studied and refined over thousands of years. The Battle of Thermopylae, the Siege of Stalingrad, the defense of Wake Island. Each one had contributed lessons that were still being taught in human military academies. The revelation that truly terrified the alien commanders came when Morrison casually mentioned that Earth maintained multiple fleets of warships, specifically designed for fighting defensive campaigns against invasion forces. These vessels were not built for exploration or conquest, but for the single purpose of making any attack on human space so costly that enemies would eventually withdraw. The colonial worlds had been defended by militia forces while the real military had been preparing for the main battle. Emergency communications began flooding coalition command centers as long-range sensors detected massive energy signatures at the edge of every contested system. Human reinforcement fleets were emerging from hyperspace in perfect coordination, their arrival timed to coincide with the moment when alien forces were most committed to planetary assaults. The humans had been using their colonial defenders to fix coalition forces in place while their real military moved into position. Commander Zexter realized with growing horror that the coalition had fallen into a trap that had been thousands of years in the making. The humans had not been trying to win the initial battles but had been gathering intelligence about alien capabilities while positioning their forces for a counterattack. Every colonial world had been a classroom where humans learned how to fight coalition forces more effectively. The tactical displays showed human fleets emerging from hyperspace with a precision that spoke to planning and coordination far beyond what primitive technology should have allowed. These were not desperate colonists fighting with hunting rifles and improvised explosives, but professional military forces equipped with weapons designed specifically for fighting technologically superior enemies. Jake Morrison stood up as his energy shackles were finally deactivated, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone who had been waiting weeks for this moment. He explained that the humans had been studying coalition military tactics since the first scouting mission had been detected, analyzing every aspect of alien technology and developing countermeasures that would level the playing field. The human fleets broadcasting across all frequencies carried the same message, transmitted in perfect coalition standard language that proved they had been monitoring alien communications for far longer than anyone had realized. The message was simple and terrifying in its implications. Remember the Alamo.